A German father burned his daughter's belongings in the courtyard and declared her dead until he met the black American soldier she married. What happened next shocked an entire nation still poisoned by Nazi propaganda. Rubble stretched as far as the eye could see across German cities in the winter of 1945. Mountains of broken brick and twisted metal marked where homes, schools, and churches once stood. Women in tattered coats picked through the debris with bare hands, salvaging anything that might be burned for warmth or traded for food. These Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, formed human chains passing stones and fragments, slowly clearing paths through the destruction. Their faces bore the hollow exhaustion of a nation that had lost everything: husbands, sons, homes, and the future they had been promised. In this landscape of devastation, American military convoys rolled through the shattered streets. Jeeps and trucks carried soldiers who had crossed an ocean to defeat the Third Reich and now remained as occupiers of a broken country. Among these forces were thousands of African American soldiers, men who had fought for freedom in Europe while their own families faced segregation and discrimination back home. They arrived in Germany with mixed feelings, victorious yet still second-class citizens in their own military, where black and white units remained strictly separated even after the war's end. The German civilians watched these convoys with complicated emotions. Defeat tasted bitter. Hunger gnawed constantly. The winter of 1945 became known as the Hunger Winter, when calories dropped so low that people ate grass and tree bark to survive. Children with distended bellies begged near military checkpoints. Old men who had survived the trenches of the First World War now stood in line for soup kitchens run by the very armies that had bombed their cities to ruins. Yet something unexpected began to happen in this unlikely setting. At military dances organized by occupation forces, at checkpoints where civilians sought passes, at work sites where Germans were employed by the American military, connections formed between German women and African American soldiers. These were not the casual encounters of conquest that marked many occupations. Something deeper emerged. Conversations, shared cigarettes, moments of genuine human connection in a world that had forgotten such things existed. For 12 years, the Nazi regime had poisoned German minds with relentless racial propaganda. Films, posters, school curricula, and public speeches had portrayed black people as subhuman, dangerous, inferior in every conceivable way. The regime had even sterilized the Rhineland bastards, mixed-race children born after World War I when French colonial troops occupied the Rhineland. These children, guilty only of their parentage, were hunted down and forcibly sterilized in the 1930s. The message was clear and brutal. Racial mixing represented the ultimate degradation. This propaganda had seeped into the German consciousness like poison into groundwater. Even Germans who had never met a black person carried these manufactured fears and hatreds. Parents warned daughters with apocalyptic language about the dangers of these American soldiers. The propaganda had been so thorough, so systematic, that it survived even the regime's total defeat. The Third Reich lay in ruins, its leaders dead or imprisoned, its ideology officially discredited. Yet the racial hatred it had cultivated continued to pulse through German society like a phantom limb. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Germany had been utterly defeated by the Allied forces, including these black American soldiers. The supposed master race had been crushed. Cities lay in rubble. Millions were dead. The concentration camps had been liberated, revealing horrors that made even hardened soldiers weep. Yet many Germans clung desperately to the one shred of superiority the Nazi years had granted them, the belief that they were racially superior to black people. It was all they had left. Into this toxic mixture of defeat, desperation, and deeply ingrained prejudice came something the propagandists had never anticipated: actual human interaction. At a dance hall in Munich, a young woman named Margaret met Sergeant James Williams from Chicago. He asked her to dance with a politeness that surprised her. They spoke in halting English and broken German about music, about the weather, about anything except the war. He told her he had studied engineering before being drafted. She told him she had worked in her father's shop before the bombing destroyed it. The conversation was ordinary, unremarkable, and for that very reason, revolutionary. In Hamburg, Hildegard encountered Private Robert Johnson at the school where she worked as a cleaning woman, and he served as part of the military administration. He was a teacher back in Philadelphia, he explained, and hoped to return to his classroom when his service ended. He treated her with a respect she had not experienced from German men in years. He asked about her opinions, listened to her answers, and never once made her feel like a defeated enemy or a potential conquest. When he offered her extra food from the military supplies, he did so with such genuine concern for her welfare that she found herself crying, the first tears she had shed since learning her brother had died at Stalingrad. In Stuttgart, Anneliese, a young widow whose husband had been killed in the final months of the war, met Corporal David Thompson from New Orleans at a military concert. He played trumpet in the military band, and his music stirred something in her that she thought had died with her husband. After the concert, he spoke to her about jazz, about Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, about the music that had sustained him through the war. His passion for beauty in a world of ugliness moved her deeply. When he asked if he could see her again, she said yes, before her rational mind could intervene with all the reasons why this was impossible. These relationships did not develop in a vacuum of pure romance. Practical realities shaped them as much as emotional connection. American soldiers had access to food, medicine, soap, chocolate, cigarettes, commodities that had become more valuable than gold in the destroyed German economy. A soldier could provide his German girlfriend with meals that meant the difference between survival and starvation. He could get medicine for a sick mother, shoes for a younger sister, coal for heating. These material considerations were real and undeniable. Yet something more than mere survival economics drove these relationships. The German women who became involved with Black American soldiers discovered men who treated them as human beings worthy of respect and consideration. After years of total war, where women had been reduced to their utility to the state, as mothers of soldiers, as factory workers, as rubble clearers, these interactions offered something precious: recognition of their individual humanity. The soldiers, for their part, found in Germany something they had rarely experienced in America: the possibility of being seen as men first, rather than as black men first. The relationships deepened despite every obstacle. Couples met in secret, away from the eyes of German neighbors and American military police. They walked in bombed-out parks where privacy could be found among the ruins. They made plans for a future that seemed impossible, but necessary to imagine. Marriage became not just a romantic aspiration, but a practical necessity, especially when pregnancies occurred. But marriage between German women and American soldiers required military permission, a bureaucratic process complicated by racial prejudice within the American military itself. Then came the moment every couple dreaded, when families discovered the relationship. The reactions followed a pattern of fury, disbelief, and absolute rejection that played out in thousands of German homes across the occupation zones. Margaret's father, a former Wehrmacht officer who had survived the Eastern Front only to return to a destroyed Munich, discovered her relationship with James Williams when a neighbor reported seeing them together. The confrontation exploded with volcanic rage. He struck her across the face, called her a whore and a traitor, and declared that she had brought more shame on the family than Germany's defeat ever could. Her mother wept but said nothing, paralyzed between her husband's fury and her daughter's tears. Her father gathered Margaret's belongings, what few possessions she still owned, and burned them in the courtyard while neighbors watched. He declared her dead to the family. She was forbidden to return, forbidden to contact her younger siblings, erased from family memory as thoroughly as if she had never been born. Hildegard's discovery came when her mother found a photograph of Robert that Hildegard had hidden in her room. The confrontation was different, but equally devastating. Her mother collapsed in tears, wailing that her daughter was throwing away her life, her reputation, her future. Her father, a dock worker whose health had been ruined by years of forced labor in a munitions factory, responded with cold fury rather than hot rage. He told Hildegard she had 1 hour to leave their apartment. When she protested, when she tried to explain that Robert was a good man, educated and kind, her father cut her off. He did not care what the man was like. The fact that he was black made everything else irrelevant. Hildegard left with a single suitcase, walking through streets where neighbors stared and whispered, knowing she could never return. Anneliese faced perhaps the cruelest rejection of all. As a widow, she lived with her late husband's parents, who had already lost their son to the war. When they discovered her relationship with David Thompson, their grief transformed into rage. They did not simply disown her. They threatened to take legal action to remove her young son, her child with their dead son, from her custody. They argued that she was an unfit mother, that her relationship with a black man proved her moral degeneracy, that they would not allow their grandson to be raised in such an environment. The threat was not empty. German courts in the immediate post-war period sometimes sided with such arguments, especially when the mother's behavior could be portrayed as scandalous. Annalisa faced an impossible choice: abandon David or risk losing her child. These personal tragedies multiplied across occupied Germany. Thousands of women faced similar confrontations, similar rejections, similar impossible choices. The pattern was remarkably consistent regardless of class, region, or family background. The Nazi propaganda had been so effective, so thorough, that it produced nearly uniform reactions across German society. A relationship with a black man represented the ultimate transgression, worse than collaboration with the enemy, worse than any other imaginable shame. The women who persisted despite this rejection demonstrated extraordinary courage. They were expelled from their homes with nothing. They lost contact with siblings, with childhood friends, with entire communities. Churches refused them. Neighbors spat at them on the street. Former friends crossed to the other side of the road to avoid speaking to them. They became pariahs in a society that had already been shattered by defeat and was desperately trying to reconstruct some sense of normalcy and respectability. Many of these women found refuge on American military bases, where they lived in a parallel world separated from German society. The bases offered safety, food, and a community of other couples facing similar ostracism. Here, German war brides formed support networks, sharing advice about navigating American military bureaucracy, teaching each other English, and preparing for the day when they might emigrate to America. Their children were born in military hospitals, registered with American authorities, existing in a legal and social limbo between two worlds. The prejudice came from both sides. While German families rejected these relationships based on Nazi racial ideology, the American military's own segregation policies created additional obstacles. Black soldiers faced restrictions on where they could socialize, which facilities they could use, and how openly they could conduct relationships with German women. White American soldiers and officers often viewed these relationships with the same racist contempt as the German families, creating a situation where the couples faced hostility from every direction except each other. Yet the relationships persisted and deepened. Couples married in military ceremonies when permission was finally granted, after months of bureaucratic obstacles. They had children who represented a future neither society was prepared to accept. They built lives in the margins, in the spaces between two hostile worlds, sustained by love and by the practical reality that they had already lost everything else and had nothing left to lose. The women who chose these relationships were not naive. They understood the costs. They knew they were sacrificing their families, their social standing, their place in German society. They made these choices anyway, driven by a combination of love, desperation, hope, and the recognition that these Black American soldiers offered something valuable: respect, stability, and the possibility of a future in a country that, however flawed, had not been reduced to rubble. The men, too, made difficult choices. They knew that bringing a German wife back to America would create complications. Segregation remained the law across much of the United States. Interracial marriage was illegal in many states. They would face hostility from white Americans who opposed any interracial relationship, and sometimes skepticism from Black Americans who questioned why they had chosen German women. Yet they persisted, driven by genuine affection and by the recognition that these relationships offered something they had rarely experienced: the possibility of being chosen for who they were as individuals rather than being rejected for the color of their skin. As months turned into years, as the immediate post-war chaos began to settle into a new normal, something unexpected began to happen. The absolute rejections began to crack. The impenetrable walls of family hostility developed fissures. The process was slow, painful, and driven by forces stronger than ideology: the pull of family bonds, the desire to know grandchildren, the simple human need for connection. Margaret's father fell ill in the winter of 1947, 2 years after he had declared his daughter dead to him. Pneumonia, weakened by years of poor nutrition and the stress of survival in post-war Munich, brought him close to death. Margaret's mother, faced with the possibility of losing her husband, broke the silence. She sent word through a former neighbor who worked on the American base, asking Margaret to come. The message was not an apology or a reconciliation, simply a notification that her father was dying. Margaret came, bringing James with her. It was not a request or a negotiation. She told her mother that if James was not welcome, she would not come at all. She had already lost her family once. She would not betray the man who had stood by her through that loss. Her mother, desperate and exhausted, agreed. The meeting happened in the cramped apartment where Margaret had grown up, now even more sparse than before, stripped of anything valuable that could be sold or traded. Her father lay in bed, gaunt and gray, struggling for breath. James Williams stood in the doorway in his military uniform, his posture military straight, his face carefully neutral. The moment stretched with unbearable tension. Then James stepped forward and introduced himself in careful German he had been learning. He spoke with respect, addressing Margaret's father with the formal Sie rather than the familiar Du. He explained that he loved Margaret, that he would care for her, that he hoped someday to earn her father's respect, even if he could never earn his approval. He did not apologize for who he was or for loving Margaret. He simply stated facts with quiet dignity. Margaret's father stared at this black American soldier standing in his home. Everything he had been taught, everything he had believed told him this was wrong, impossible, shameful. Yet here was a man speaking respectfully, standing with dignity, clearly devoted to his daughter. Here was a man who had not abandoned Margaret when she was disowned, who had supported her through the hardest period of her life, who was now showing respect to a father who had shown him nothing but hatred. The transformation was not immediate or complete. Margaret's father did not suddenly abandon his prejudices, but something shifted. Over the following weeks, as he slowly recovered, James visited regularly. He brought medicine from the military hospital. He brought food. He treated Margaret's mother with courtesy and her younger siblings with kindness. He spoke about his plans to finish his engineering degree when he returned to America, to build a good life for Margaret and their future children, to work hard and provide stability. Margaret's father began to see not a racial category, but an individual man. He observed how James treated his daughter, with respect, with affection, with partnership rather than domination. He noticed James's education, his intelligence, his work ethic. He saw qualities that he had to admit were admirable, qualities that were increasingly rare among the available German men of that era, many of whom were traumatized by combat, physically disabled, or psychologically broken by defeat. The final breakthrough came when Margaret gave birth to a son. The baby was brought to meet his grandfather, and the old man held his mixed-race grandson with trembling hands. The child was innocent, perfect, undeniably his blood. In that moment, ideology collided with the overwhelming reality of family love. The grandfather wept, and in his tears was the beginning of genuine transformation. Within a year, Margaret's father had done something remarkable. He publicly acknowledged his mistake. He told neighbors who had witnessed Margaret's expulsion that he had been wrong, that James was a good man, that his daughter had chosen well. In a society where admitting error was seen as weakness, this public recantation was extraordinary. He went further, defending other German women in similar situations, arguing that these black American soldiers were often better men than the German alternatives. Hildegard's reconciliation followed a different path, but reached a similar destination. Her mother, unable to bear the separation, began visiting secretly after 18 months. She came to the small apartment near the military base where Hildegard and Robert lived. What she found shocked her, not because it was scandalous, but because it was so utterly normal and even admirable. The apartment was clean, well-organized, and better supplied than any German home she had visited in years. Robert was there, and he greeted her with polite respect, despite knowing she had supported Hildegard's expulsion. He offered her coffee, real coffee, not the ersatz substitute most Germans drank, and spoke to her about his life, his teaching career, his plans for the future. He showed her the books he was reading, the lesson plans he was developing for when he returned to teaching. He spoke about his own family in Philadelphia, about his mother who had worked as a domestic servant to put him through college, about his father who had served in the First World War. Hildegard's mother saw her daughter genuinely happy for the first time since before the war. She saw a man who treated her daughter as an equal partner, who consulted her opinions, who shared household duties, behaviors that were unusual in traditional German marriages of that era. She saw stability, respect, and genuine affection. Everything she had been told about black men, everything the propaganda had claimed, collided with the reality sitting in front of her drinking coffee and discussing literature. She returned home and told her husband what she had seen. He resisted at first, clinging to his prejudices, but his wife persisted, and eventually, worn down by her arguments and his own loneliness for his daughter, he agreed to meet Robert. The meeting was stiff and awkward, but Robert's quiet dignity and obvious devotion to Hildegard made an impression. When Robert spoke about his teaching philosophy, about his belief in education as the path to a better life, Hildegard's father, who had never had the opportunity for much education himself, found himself nodding in agreement. The reconciliation accelerated when Robert helped Hildegard's family with practical matters. He used his military connections to get Hildegard's father better medical care for his work-related injuries. He provided food and supplies. He treated Hildegard's younger siblings with kindness, helping them with their English homework and bringing them small gifts. He demonstrated through actions, not words, that he was a good man who loved their daughter and wanted to be part of their family. Within 2 years, Hildegard's parents had fully reconciled with their daughter and accepted Robert as their son-in-law. Her mother told neighbors that she had been wrong, that Robert was one of the finest men she had ever met. Her father, in a moment of painful honesty, admitted that Robert treated Hildegard better than he had ever treated his own wife, and that perhaps there were things German men needed to learn about respecting women. Anneliese's story took the longest to resolve, but perhaps demonstrated the most profound transformation. Her in-laws' threat to take her son created a crisis that forced David Thompson to demonstrate his character in the most concrete way possible. When Anneliese's son fell seriously ill with scarlet fever, David took charge. He got the boy admitted to the military hospital, where treatment was far superior to what was available in German civilian facilities. He sat by the child's bedside for days, missing duty and risking disciplinary action. He paid for medications out of his own salary. He treated this German child, the son of a dead German soldier, as if he were his own. Anneliese's in-laws came to the hospital, prepared to take their grandson away from what they considered an immoral situation. Instead, they found David sitting beside the boy's bed, reading to him in halting German, holding his hand, providing comfort. The nurses told them that this American soldier had barely left the child's side, that he had advocated fiercely for the best treatment, that his devotion had been absolute. The in-laws watched David with their grandson over the following weeks as the boy recovered. They saw genuine love, not obligation. They saw a man willing to be a father to a child who was not biologically his, who carried the blood of the enemy he had fought against. They saw selflessness and devotion that shamed their own behavior. The transformation was painful for them. They had to confront not only their prejudice against David because of his race, but also their cruelty toward Anneliese, their willingness to use their grandson as a weapon, their clinging to hatred even after losing their son to war. The reckoning was difficult, but it was genuine. They apologized to Anneliese and David, a formal and tearful apology that acknowledged the depth of their wrong. They asked to be part of their lives, to know their grandson, to accept David as family. More than that, they did something extraordinary. They publicly defended David and Anneliese to their community. When neighbors criticized the relationship, Anneliese's father-in-law told them bluntly that David was a better man than most Germans he knew, including himself. He said that David had shown more honor and compassion than the regime they had all supported, and that perhaps it was time to judge people by their actions rather than their skin color. These 3 stories were not unique. They represented a pattern that played out across occupied Germany in thousands of families. The pattern was documented by German sociologists who began studying these interracial marriages in the early 1950s, producing research that challenged every assumption about race, marriage, and social stability. The data was striking and unambiguous. Marriages between Black American soldiers and German women had significantly lower divorce rates than traditional German marriages of the same period. The researchers found this result so unexpected that they repeated their studies multiple times, but the findings remained consistent. These interracial marriages, which had been predicted to fail spectacularly, were actually more stable and successful than conventional marriages. The researchers identified several factors that explained this surprising outcome. First, these couples had overcome enormous obstacles to be together. They had faced rejection from families, hostility from communities, and bureaucratic barriers from military authorities. The very difficulty of forming these relationships meant that only couples with genuine commitment and compatibility persisted. These were not marriages of convenience or social expectation. They were marriages of choice made despite every possible discouragement. Second, the economic stability provided by American military employment created a foundation that many German marriages lacked. Black American soldiers, despite facing discrimination within the military, still received regular salaries, housing allowances, and access to military supplies. This economic security was extraordinary in the context of post-war Germany, where unemployment was high and economic instability was the norm. German women married to Black American soldiers often had better material conditions than their peers married to German men. Third, the soldiers themselves often brought qualities that were valuable in marriage partners. Many had education levels that were high by the standards of the time. The military had provided opportunities for Black Americans that were often denied to them in civilian life, including technical training, leadership experience, and exposure to the world beyond their home communities. These men had ambition, skills, and plans for the future. Fourth, the relationships demonstrated patterns of mutual respect and partnership that were less common in traditional German marriages of that era. The German women who married Black American soldiers often reported that their husbands treated them as equals, consulted their opinions, and shared in household decisions. This partnership model contrasted with the more hierarchical and patriarchal patterns common in German marriages, where husbands expected obedience and wives were expected to be subordinate. Fifth, these couples had a shared experience of overcoming prejudice that created a strong bond. They had faced hostility together, supported each other through rejection and isolation, and built their relationship in opposition to social pressure. This shared struggle created a foundation of loyalty and mutual support that strengthened the marriage. The German families who reconciled with their daughters and accepted their Black American sons-in-law underwent profound transformations. They had to confront the falseness of the propaganda they had believed. They had to acknowledge that they had been wrong, not just about these specific men, but about their entire racial worldview. This was not easy. It required admitting that they had been deceived, that they had hurt their own children based on lies, that they had clung to a sense of superiority that had no basis in reality. The contrast with available German men made the transformation easier in some ways. The war had killed millions of German men, creating a severe gender imbalance. The men who survived were often physically or psychologically damaged. Many struggled with trauma, alcoholism, unemployment, and the shame of defeat. The German economy was slowly recovering, but opportunities were limited. In this context, Black American soldiers who had steady employment, education, ambition, and psychological stability were objectively attractive as marriage partners, regardless of race. German families began to recognize this reality. Mothers who had wept at their daughters' choices began to admit that these Black American sons-in-law were providing better lives for their daughters than most German men could offer. Fathers who had raged about racial purity began to acknowledge that their grandsons were being raised with opportunities and stability that would have been impossible in Germany. The practical realities of post-war life eroded ideological commitments. The reconciliations had ripple effects through communities. When respected families publicly accepted their Black American sons-in-law, it gave permission for others to reconsider their own prejudices. When grandfathers who had served in the Wehrmacht acknowledged that these Black soldiers were good men, it carried weight. Slowly, incrementally, the absolute social prohibition against these relationships began to soften. This did not mean that prejudice disappeared. Germany in the 1950s remained a deeply conservative society, struggling to come to terms with its Nazi past. Racism persisted, often in subtle forms. Mixed-race children faced discrimination in schools and communities. But the absolute violent rejection that had characterized the immediate post-war period began to give way to grudging acceptance and, in many cases, genuine respect and affection. The most dramatic evidence of transformation came in the emigration patterns. As Black American soldiers completed their service and returned to the United States, their German wives went with them. This was expected. What was not expected was that hundreds of German families followed. Parents who had disowned their daughters for marrying Black men now emigrated to America to be near their daughters and grandchildren. These German families settled in Black American communities across the United States, in Chicago, Philadelphia, New Orleans, Detroit, Los Angeles. They lived in neighborhoods they would never have imagined entering. They attended Black churches, celebrated in Black communities, and became part of extended Black American families. The irony was profound. People who had been indoctrinated with Nazi racial ideology now lived as minorities in Black American communities, dependent on the welcome and acceptance of the very people they had been taught to despise. The emigration was not easy. These German families faced their own challenges in America. They struggled with English, with American culture, with the reality of American segregation. They discovered that their Black American sons-in-law and grandchildren faced discrimination and barriers in their own country. They witnessed Jim Crow laws, segregated facilities, and racial violence. Some became advocates against racism, using their own transformation as testimony to the possibility of change. Margaret's father emigrated to Chicago in 1955, 10 years after he had burned his daughter's belongings and declared her dead to him. He lived with Margaret and James in their home on the South Side, in a Black neighborhood where he was one of the few white residents. He learned to navigate this world, shopping at Black-owned stores, attending a Black church, becoming friends with James's family. In his final years, he spoke publicly about his transformation, telling anyone who would listen that he had been poisoned by Nazi lies and that meeting James had saved him from dying in that poison. He told his grandchildren, mixed-race children growing up in 1950s America, about his journey from hatred to love. He did not hide his past or pretend he had always been enlightened. He told them honestly that he had once believed terrible things, that he had hurt their mother, that he had been wrong. He told them that people could change, that prejudice could be overcome, that love was stronger than ideology. His grandchildren remembered him as a man who had made terrible mistakes, but had found the courage to acknowledge them and change. Hildegard's parents emigrated to Philadelphia in 1958. Her mother integrated into the Black church community where Robert and Hildegard worshipped, joining the choir and becoming active in church activities. She formed close friendships with Black women her age, relationships that would have been unimaginable to her a decade earlier. She told these friends about her journey, about how she had almost lost her daughter to prejudice, about how Robert had taught her family what it meant to be truly good. Her father found work in a factory where he worked alongside Black men. He joined a union that was fighting for civil rights and workers' rights. He became an advocate for integration and equality, using his own story as an example of how prejudice could be overcome. He told his co-workers that his son-in-law had taught him more about honor and dignity than the German military ever had. Annalise's in-laws emigrated to New Orleans in 1960, drawn by their desire to be near their grandson and the mixed-race grandchildren who had followed. They settled in a neighborhood near David and Annalisa, becoming part of the community. David's music career had flourished. He played in clubs and taught music lessons, part of the vibrant New Orleans jazz scene. Annalisa's in-laws attended his performances, sitting in integrated audiences, applauding Black musicians, participating in a culture they had once been taught to view as inferior. They became advocates against prejudice in their German community back home, writing letters and speaking out when they returned for visits. They told other Germans that everything they had been taught about Black people was a lie, that they had found more kindness and acceptance in Black American communities than they had shown to their own daughter-in-law. They urged other families not to make the mistakes they had made, not to let prejudice destroy their families. The children of these unions grew up with unique perspectives. They were raised in Black American communities but carried German heritage. They spoke English with their fathers and German with their mothers and grandparents. They ate soul food and German food. They celebrated American holidays and German traditions. They navigated the complexity of being mixed race in 1950s and 1960s America, a time when racial categories were rigidly enforced, and mixed-race identity was often viewed with suspicion by both black and white communities. Many of these children became involved in the civil rights movement. They had grown up hearing stories of their parents' struggle against prejudice. They had witnessed their grandparents' transformations from hatred to love. They understood viscerally that racism was learned, not innate, and that it could be unlearned. They brought this understanding to their activism, arguing for the possibility of change and reconciliation, even as they fought against injustice. Some became educators, following in the footsteps of fathers like Robert Johnson, who had been teachers. They worked in integrated schools, teaching children of all races, using their own family stories to illustrate the possibility of overcoming prejudice. Others became musicians, artists, writers, using their creative talents to explore themes of identity, belonging, and transformation. The families maintained connections across the Atlantic. German grandparents visited America regularly. American grandchildren visited Germany, experiencing the country their mothers had fled, seeing the rebuilding and transformation of a nation. These visits were complicated. Germany was still processing its Nazi past, still struggling with questions of guilt and responsibility. But the family connections provided a human bridge across that historical chasm. The broader historical significance of these marriages and reconciliations extends beyond the individual stories. They demonstrated something profound about the nature of prejudice and its fragility when confronted with human reality. The Nazi regime had spent 12 years systematically indoctrinating Germans with racial hatred. The propaganda had been sophisticated, pervasive, and backed by state power. It had seemed to succeed in creating a population that genuinely believed in racial hierarchy and the dangers of racial mixing. Yet this carefully constructed ideology crumbled when confronted with personal encounter. When German parents actually met the black American soldiers their daughters had married, when they observed these men's behavior and character, when they held their mixed-race grandchildren, the propaganda lost its power. The abstract categories of racial ideology could not withstand the concrete reality of individual human beings who defied those categories. This reveals something important about how prejudice operates and how it can be overcome. Prejudice thrives on distance and abstraction. It is easy to hate a category of people you have never met, to believe terrible things about groups you have no personal experience with. Propaganda works by creating and reinforcing these abstract categories, by preventing personal encounter that might challenge the stereotypes. But personal encounter is powerful. When people are forced to interact with individuals from groups they have been taught to hate, when they cannot avoid seeing the humanity of those individuals, prejudice becomes much harder to maintain. This does not mean that personal encounter automatically eliminates prejudice. People are capable of maintaining prejudice even in the face of contradictory evidence. But personal encounter creates the possibility of change in a way that abstract argument often cannot. The German families who reconciled with their daughters and black American sons-in-law had to confront the gap between what they had been taught and what they experienced. They had been taught that black people were inferior, dangerous, and unsuitable as family members. They experienced black men who were educated, respectful, devoted to their families, and often more stable and successful than the German alternatives. The gap between ideology and reality became impossible to ignore. Economic and social context also played crucial roles. The desperation of post-war Germany made the practical advantages of these marriages impossible to ignore. When your daughter is well-fed, well-housed, and well-treated while your neighbors are struggling with hunger and homelessness, ideology becomes a luxury you cannot afford. When your mixed-race grandchildren have opportunities that pure German children lack, racial purity becomes less important than practical welfare. This does not diminish the genuine transformations that occurred. The German parents who reconciled with their daughters did not simply make cynical calculations about material advantage. They underwent real changes in belief and attitude. They came to genuinely respect and love their black American sons-in-law. They became advocates against the prejudice they had once embodied. But the economic and social context created the conditions that made these transformations possible. The story of these German war brides and their Black American husbands is ultimately a story about the possibility of change. It demonstrates that even deeply ingrained prejudice, even hatred backed by state power and systematic propaganda, can be overcome. It shows that people are capable of recognizing their mistakes, changing their beliefs, and building new relationships across lines that once seemed absolute. It is also a story about courage. The courage of the women who chose love despite losing everything. The courage of the men who persisted in relationships despite facing hostility from all sides. And the courage of the families who admitted they were wrong and worked to make amends. Change requires courage because it means acknowledging error, giving up familiar beliefs, and entering unknown territory. The legacy of these relationships continues. The children and grandchildren of these unions carry forward the story of their parents' and grandparents' courage and transformation. They embody the possibility of bridging divides, of creating family and community across racial and national lines. They are living proof that the categories that divide us are less powerful than the connections that unite us. From the rubble of post-war Germany, something unexpected grew. Families that had been destroyed by hatred were rebuilt through love. People who had been taught to despise each other became family. Grandparents who had disowned their daughters ended their lives surrounded by the mixed-race grandchildren they had once threatened to take away. The transformation was not universal. Many families never reconciled. Many prejudices persisted. But it happened often enough to demonstrate that change is possible. The German parents who learned to love their Black American sons-in-law discovered something that propaganda had hidden from them. That dignity, respect, honor, and love have no color. They learned that the content of a person's character matters more than the color of their skin. Though they learned this lesson painfully and late, they learned that the ideology they had embraced had poisoned them, had nearly cost them their families, and had been based on lies. In the end, these stories offer a powerful lesson for any time and place where prejudice divides people. They show that propaganda, no matter how sophisticated or pervasive, cannot permanently overcome the human capacity for connection. They demonstrate that personal encounter can challenge even the most deeply held prejudices. They prove that families can be rebuilt, that mistakes can be acknowledged, and that love can triumph over hatred. The thousands of German families who were transformed by meeting their Black American sons-in-law left a legacy that extends far beyond their individual stories. They demonstrated that change is possible, that prejudice can be overcome, and that human connection is more powerful than ideology. In a world that often seems divided by insurmountable barriers of race, religion, and nationality, their stories remind us that these barriers are not as solid as they appear, and that the courage to cross them can transform not just individuals, but entire families and communities. A German father burned his daughter's belongings in the courtyard and declared her dead, until he met the Black American soldier she married. What happened next shocked an entire nation still poisoned by Nazi propaganda.